Ich switche noch mal kurz auf Deutsch, wobei unsere Inputs heute Morgen alle auf Englisch sind. Aber als Einführung, wie geht es jetzt weiter mit dem Tag? Also heute Vormittag werden wir uns mit zwei zentralen Fragen beschäftigen. Und die eine Frage ist vor allem, wie können wir in der Politik oder was können wir in der Politik und auch wie können wir das tun, von kollaborativen Ansätzen und Innovationen über die Sektoren hinweg lernen. Und der zweite Themenbereich ist, wie können wir mehr Experimente fördern. Und wir haben zwei spannende Lightning Talks und möchte, genau, mit dem ersten beginnen wir. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass Chiara Bleckenwegner heute Morgen hier ist und Benjamin Kumpf, die ich herzlich begrüße und auf die Bühne bitte. Herzlich willkommen. Chiara Bleckenwegner ist Innovation Policy Advisor bei OECD OPSI und Benjamin Kumpf ist Head of OECD Innovation for Development Facility. Chiara and Benjamin, welcome. I'm delighted having you here this morning. So what is it that you will address in your lightning talk?
Thank you, Marte. It's a really great pleasure to be here, even though virtually. I will give a brief overview of the public sector innovation facets model that we use at OPSI, a way to systematize innovation activities in government. And then I'll hand over to my colleague, Ben.
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will start sharing my screen if I can. Are you able to see this? Excellent. My name is Chiara Bleckenwegner. I work at the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. The first part of this lightning talk is about the public sector innovation facets model, and then Ben will talk about how the OECD supports mission-oriented innovation through the new OECD Mission Action Lab. At the observatory, our work broadly consists in three things. We work with public sector organizations to identify what's next. For instance, scanning the global trends in public sector innovation each year. We turn the new into normal, meaning we observe and collect innovation approaches and tools and make innovation best practice available to governments through our Toolkit Navigator or our Declaration on Public Sector Innovation. And finally, we provide trusted advice to national governments and public sector organizations who implement innovation, including doing innovation system scans or working on specific topics such as anticipatory innovation or mission-oriented innovation in countries. At OPSI, we define innovation as novel or new to the context, must be implemented on the ground, and it should have impact and or shift public value. Of course, governments have always innovated, and they need to do so now more than ever, as Jeff already pointed out. In fact, I would argue that complex and cross-cutting policy challenges, such as the already mentioned climate change, caring for the elderly, automating work, cybersecurity, that require innovation have become the norm rather than the exception. So governments are called to innovate not at the margins or in pockets, but at the center of government itself. But innovation still generally happens because of serendipity rather than design. We observe that most commonly innovation happens reactively in response to political and administrative reforms, such as a change in the mandate of a ministry, for example, in reaction to crises such as Corona, in fulfillment of new core missions, such as climate goals, or in response to technological change, for example, the need to provide digital channels for public services. But often, as Jeff has said, is mostly because of individual innovation offices or project teams who go above and beyond to drive change. They do the mystical in public sector systems that are not necessarily set up for innovation. So it is very positive to see that public sector innovation has started to institutionalize, professionalize in OECD countries, but it's not yet systemic or systematic, it's still mystical. So public sector innovation as an emerging field still needs tools and methods that help to link government's challenges to the innovation practice. And that is the very reason that OPSI set out to systematize public sector innovation through this facets model. The model is based on our work in countries, our public sector innovation system studies in countries like Denmark, Canada, Brazil, and it's substantiated with extensive evidence gathering and literature reviews. The 4 types of innovation we have identified are enhancement-oriented innovation. This is about how might we do things that we currently do better. Adaptive innovation. This concerns how might the context that changes influence a new need that we need to fill. Anticipatory innovation is about how might the future change what we do now. And mission-oriented innovation is about how might we achieve a goal. So this model provides an easy way to consider what innovative approaches and instruments governments can use to respond to different challenges. It helps governments to gain a new understanding of innovation, make strategic choices about the types of innovation they want to invest in, and it helps to build the structures across government required for innovation to happen. I will give a quick overview of each one of the facets. Enhancement-oriented innovation, as I said, is about doing things better. This could mean upgrading practices, achieving better results, or quick wins. Governments might use this type of innovation when they need to digitalize their services, organizations. In practice, you might see public sector organizations using, for example, lean methods to run a large infrastructure project more efficiently. Or they might use behavioral nudges to increase people's compliance with paying fines or taxes. Or they might increase the volume of responding to inquiries from the public by using digital forms. Now, a famous example from practice is Estonia's seamless family benefit system. This is designed to reduce the bureaucratic burden for government. It consists in databases between departments being connected so that when the birth of a baby is registered in one department, it automatically triggers a notification to the benefits team in another department to link up the services. So the purpose of this type of innovation is typically really to reduce costs, increase efficiency, perhaps widen the reach of public services, or simply make them more reliable. Adaptive innovation is a type of innovation that tests new approaches in order to respond to a changing operating environment or a new need. So, for example, co-designing a vaccine app during a pandemic. Adaptive innovation manifests in practice through, for instance, teleworking arrangements during COVID, or adapting communication strategies, to use social media more heavily. For instance, when national rail services make service announcements through Twitter. One example from Japan is the Agile Governance Framework. This allows civil servants all across governments to use an agile approach to any innovation project they tackle. So they're able to constantly revise the scope of the project based on changing circumstances. So the purpose of this type of innovation, adaptive innovation, is to develop a more diverse range of choices and innovations to solve new needs and create solutions that make sense for users in specific circumstances. Mission-oriented innovation, which Ben will go into later, is broadly about achieving a clear and ambitious goal. In essence, missions address broad societal challenges like climate change by setting concrete outcomes like becoming carbon neutral by 2030. The missions that we have seen in practice so far, this is still a new approach, of course, often deal with net zero, as Jeff mentioned, or complex health issues like beating cancer. They very heavily rely on things like futures thinking, private-public partnerships, and many other mechanisms. One example from Australia is the draft resilience mission. Australia faces drafts due to global warming and needs to become more resilient to the impacts. But this requires innovation in many different sectors, ranging from agriculture to fire services to mental health support in rural communities. So this type of mission-oriented of innovation is to generate interest and investment from the public, from private sector, towards a common overarching goal and drive a systemic change through a really powerful narrative. And finally, the fourth type of innovation facet is anticipatory innovation. This asks, how might emerging possibilities fundamentally change what government could or should do now? Explores issues such as artificial intelligence or the future of work to change what we do now and to get to a better future. So government would typically opt for this type of innovation when there's a high degree of uncertainty about how things might evolve. In the public sector, practices you might see involve using strategic foresight methodologies to get a clearer sense of future trends. But they also include embedding anticipatory working methods in day-to-day government processes, like using sandboxes. An example from the UK is the FinTech sandbox run by the Financial Conduct Authority. It runs every year since 2016, and each year they choose one future trend that might impact the UK public. Last year it was digital nomads or a more mobile workforce working across borders. The FCA gave synthetic data about financial transactions online to a cohort of private sector firms who could test new services to reduce fraud and protect vulnerable customers if they had the real data and could formulate what regulatory changes they would need from the government. So the purpose of this type of innovation, of anticipatory innovation, is to pick up on those weak signals and engage with them before a new course of action is locked in. We often get the question, what is the difference between strategic foresight, which is well established, and anticipatory innovation? The two have close ties, but there is a difference. We see that there's a wave of so-called future readiness entering policymaking, and foresight activities are getting increased importance through new foresight units opening in governments, for example. So strategic foresight is helpful because it identifies early signs of disruptions. It reframes what should be considered in policymaking. It stress tests strategies against disruptions, but it's not enough on its own to make a difference on the ground. Strategic foresight methods are designed to imagine possible futures, but they are not designed to ensure that any particular future result comes from the process. So governments need to learn to anticipate, create the knowledge about futures through foresight, but also make that knowledge actionable through implementing real innovation on the ground. And for this to work, governments need a new governance approach to support innovation that's based on experimentation. And it's this difference that we call the impact gap. So anticipatory innovation is the government's capacity to use strategic foresight in order to take policy action. An example of this is the Committee for Technological Innovation and Ethics in Sweden. It has a specific purpose of helping the government identify policy challenges and contribute to reducing uncertainty surrounding existing regulations that might be in conflict with emerging trends. So the committee delivers policy proposals, for example, on AI, to adapt or review regulatory frameworks. OPSI works with anticipatory innovation with national government partners extensively. You can read more about the work in the publications listed here. Just a quick overview, we work in Ireland to build anticipatory innovation capability across all areas of government. In Slovenia, we helped the government prototype anticipatory innovations to prepare for potential move to full remote work. And in Finland, we work on a range of topics such as carbon neutrality, better child well-being policies, and so on. So people working in the public sector will have probably recognized many, if not all, of these types of innovation from their own work. And in fact, most public sector innovations have a portfolio of these innovation activities, whether it is intentional or not. The model helps you simply to more strategically understand, use, and direct innovation in the public sector. As Jeff said, stewardship and one place that owns the knowledge of the bigger picture is key. Types of innovation are complementary, not mutually exclusive, and having a good balance helps the public sector to be more balanced and more resilient. One quick example of how these are complementary is anticipatory innovation and mission-oriented innovation. This has become a topic at European level as well, but it just illustrates how these are complementary. For example, mission-oriented innovation sets a long-term ambition, but you need anticipatory innovation to explore the kind of futures we want to achieve. Mission-oriented innovation tackles the complex problems, but anticipatory innovation helps to stress test those plans by considering what changes might disrupt the progress. Or mission-oriented innovation relies on trying many different solutions to achieve the mission. And anticipatory innovation makes the space for that experimentation to happen. So you can read more about each facet and how to manage the whole portfolio in the publications listed here. And now over to Ben for a closer look at mission-oriented innovation.
Thanks, Chiara. I will also quickly share my screen. And good morning aus Paris. I work at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, and we work with foreign ministries and implementing agencies for the official development assistance in the OECD member states on strengthening the practice of how innovation is done in partner countries, providing more evidence for the business case for innovation and the fact that we need to advance diverse innovations and accelerate learning through convening innovation leads from development agencies, building networks and connecting them to innovators from the global south. About mission-oriented innovation, I'd like you to just take a look at that picture and contrast the two mules that you see. What's not on the picture is the wooden wagon on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Saturn rocket. That image was staged to show the inequalities in the US of 1969, just a few days before the 20th of July, where under the Kennedy administration, the US achieved to send a man to the moon. One of the famous missions that required collaboration across sectors and diverse innovations, not only in rocket science, but textiles, nutrition. But the 500 or so civil activists who staged this image outlined that we need to direct missions, the investments and the political attention to the existing social inequalities that we have here on Earth, as opposed to science, technology-driven innovations and arguably geopolitics. 9 years later, Richard Nelson wrote The Moon and the Ghetto, where he essentially argued that the fact that we as humanity, particularly some nations that are wealthy, are so advanced, but are not able to deal with problems such as poverty, lack of education, quality education for all and others, is partially due to politics, but mainly due to our insufficient scientific progress. And I would like to challenge that and actually argue that when we talk about mission-oriented innovation, the one thing that you might want to take away is, broadly speaking, question the hype and think beyond STI policies and engage in politics and power. So to pick up Jeff's point on think like an engineer, I would propose adding on and to a degree as an activist or politicians by really diving into issues of struggles, politics, and power. When we talk about mission-oriented innovation, picking up from what Chiara said, our colleagues at OPSI work with OECD member country counterparts in the high-income countries. We work with development agencies, with financing institutions, and with governments in low-income countries to look at where do missions exist, how are missions unfolding in a development context, and what can the missions from high, low, and middle-income countries learn from each other. In addition to the characteristics that Chiara mentioned, I just want to point to the importance of the legitimacy of the fact that missions, of course, have to be implemented, and the cross-sectoral coordination is such an important issue that I'll go into a bit more depth in my next point. And the issue of sustained commitment, a major challenge. And to outline those, here's one example that encompasses low and middle income countries. It's how can we provide access to family planning methods to a significant number of adolescent girls and women. It started off with a measurable mission and market shaping instruments, which wasn't achieved by 2020, and is now turned to a broader movement where national governments with many countries in sub-Saharan Africa commit on specific measurable objectives. But it's broader than the mere access for a measurable amount of women to have choice and agency over family planning. It's about the softer components that Jeff also outlined, such as social capital, and particularly how might we measure agency of women and girls and enhance political participation, as you can see in the vision statement for the next year. And I'm mentioning this because one of my first points that I want to make is thinking of mission-oriented innovation, we have to think of flexibility and adjusting to new emerging political trends, mega trends that still influence on a short-term basis how missions are being shaped and the support is. And it cannot only be about the mere technical aspects. Going back to one of the missions that Chiara mentioned in 10 Swedish cities, and the number is growing. It's about carbon neutrality by 2030, along with human well-being with planetary boundaries. So other features that I want to mention that are important to take away for our context in Germany is the fact that the successful mission is premised on diverse innovations beyond technical solutions and single point solutions, particularly innovations in the policy space and in market shaping instruments. In the case of the family planning mission, that, for example, entails an advanced market commitment by 2 foundations and 2 bilateral donors, with, in this case, Pfizer, that developed a self-injectable contraceptive that's durable for 3 months, where this is embedded in national health systems on a community level, with a lot of inquiry on social innovations in terms of behavior change and identifying positive outliers in communities that might have influencing capacity on the community level. It's about the flexibility, as I mentioned, but the things that we're seeing that I think are insightful for mission contexts in Germany and other OECD countries, issues around financing, the projectization of aid is reflected also in the short-term projects and short-term financing instruments that we have in our context. Along with sustained commitment, we're seeing changes in priorities by governments, between changes in governments, and while missions on paper promise to have longevity, we see that what's really crucial is sufficient bottom-up traction and sufficient participation. Now, we know that from our research on governance within the OECD that participation by citizens is a necessary but not sufficient condition for better development and governance outcomes. So it cannot stop at mere participation. It requires a set of tools that include experimental policy design. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over a couple of these elements that we identified in our work, looking at missions across country typologies. The first one mirrors a point that Jeff made, however. We have a number of missions that have complex societal challenges at its heart. And the family planning one that I just mentioned is one, because advancing gender equality is, of course, a wicked problem. There are other missions that might be characterized as complicated if we use the Cynefin framework as our analytical lens that differentiates between complex, complicated, simple, and chaotic problems. What we learned, however, is even a complicated mission, and we're working with, for example, partners that support the government in sub-Saharan Africa on the electrification of all households in the country. Arguably a complicated mission, but parts of the country are going through an insurrection, there's insecurity and armed conflict, and that of course opens up a whole range of complicated issues. So what we learned is even if a mission is around the complicated sphere, it will have sub-challenges that are complex, and government needs to prepare for complex problem, potentially using the 2x2 that Jeff presented. And what we are seeing is a lot of elements around open innovation as part of the toolbox that can help governments tap into the best ideas from local innovators and beyond to advance concrete solutions. I just want to mention the last few things. We've seen a couple of missions that are premised on anticipated problems and some that are reactive to intractable problems that haven't been solved. And there's a huge opportunity to be anticipatory and invest in proactive missions. But we're seeing a massive supply push in terms of mission, particularly in development context, and insufficient consideration of investing in social innovations and identifying positive deviants and innovators on the ground and thinking about how we might scale that up. And there's good practice coming out of countries such as Bangladesh or India. And to mention an important point around missions, what we are seeing is the question whether there's new funding available to drive a mission or existing funding is repurposed is really important, also in the context of coordination mechanisms. For us, essentially an exam question where no best practice to our knowledge exists is, are the existing coordination mechanisms that always exist across sectors and ministries are fit for purpose to drive a mission, to have near real-time learning and implement in a dynamic way a portfolio of different interventions and innovations and learn and adapt? Or are they too stale, too inflexible? Do we need new coordination mechanisms? And what we are seeing that politics play a huge role. One of the countries that we are working with, for example, had a arguably supply-driven mission steered out of the STI responsible ministry. And when we saw insufficient uptake across other line ministries and had the recommendation that it should be the Prime Minister office that should take on the coordination role, there was massive pushback from the STI ministry related to prestige, to funding. So real time and real life realpolitik plays a huge role in mission-oriented innovation. And there we see a massive evidence gap. To conclude, we just launched together with OPSI and the STI Directorate at the OECD, the Mission Action Lab, where we're looking at filling some of the evidence gap we're seeing and what works for mission implementation, cross-sectoral coordination, and dynamic management of innovation portfolios, with the intent to translate those through action research into practical tools that have been tested and can add value to mission implementers in low, middle, and high-income countries. And to conclude, I want to go back to Jeff and highly recommend to the audience an essay he wrote on the imaginary crisis, and also link to Indy's talk, who with Dark Matter Labs is one of the forefront thinkers, pioneer in imagining radically different futures. Thinking about the family planning mission. About 100 years ago, it might have seemed almost unthinkable to imagine a future where women have agency over having a child or not. And it's thanks to activists and women movement activists, suffragettes, to advance that. And actually going back to thinking about the development of the pill, for example, it can be linked to social movements that influence research. And I want to drive that point home, not only because the bottom-up traction is so important, but I see a role also for colleagues working in academia, in science and engineering, to think about what is your role in imagining radically different futures, and through experimental design, working on bringing them into being. And with that, thanks a lot, and back to you, Martin.
Thank you so much, Chiara and Benjamin, for sharing the insights and also the facet model, which I think we can utilize in a really good way to think about innovation and also to categorize it. So since it's 1 week before Christmas, maybe each of you can share one Christmas wish with us for the innovation ecosystem. So what would be your advice or wish for next year regarding innovation? Chiara, do you want to start?
Probably thinking about how the crisis has made room for taking a little bit more risks in the public sector, embracing more uncommon types of innovation, such as anticipatory or mission-oriented innovation. My wish would be that next year we build on those different types and give them a bit more space to grow and be tested. Government.
Thank you. Benjamin.
My wish is that people in decision-making positions and financing positions expand their view of ecosystems beyond the innovation hotspots. We're seeing across countries increasing evidence that successful innovation leads to new inequalities between regions, and ecosystems are often geographically for capitals or other hotspots, in Silicon Valley or Nairobi. But so much important innovation is happening in rural areas, and we have to address new inequalities being created through successful innovation and expand our view on ecosystems. That's my wish.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.